The legend of the skull wine was whispered with a hushed reverence in Funam, a remote village nestled on the edge of an ancient jungle. For centuries, the tale was passed down like a dark inheritance, its details steeped in both fear and fascination. It was said to be no ordinary brew, but a concoction steeped in sorrow and death, fermented within the skulls of the dead. The ritual, as the elders claimed, was more than sacrilege. It was a transgression against the natural order, a doorway to the underworld that allowed the spirits of the damned to linger among the living. Dr. Adrian Locke first heard of the tale during a conference on Southeast Asian folklore. As a respected parapsychologist, Adrian was no stranger to the macabre. He had documented ghostly apparitions, explored cursed ruins, and even participated in exorcisms. Yet the story of the skull wine struck a chord he couldn't ignore. The idea of spirits tethered to a forbidden ritual intrigued him, blending anthropology and the supernatural in a way that ignited his relentless curiosity. Funam, his colleague had said over coffee one evening. That's where the ritual supposedly began. But no one goes there willingly. The locals believe the entire village is cursed. Adrian dismissed the notion of curses, chalking it up to fear and superstition. Yet, as he pored over archives and field notes from other researchers, he noticed an unsettling consistency. Accounts of vanished travelers, eerie whispers heard at night, and a jungle shrine where skulls were said to be consecrated with rice wine. The more he learned, the more obsessed he became. By the time Adrian boarded a rusted bus heading toward Funam, he had convinced himself this would be his most groundbreaking study. Equipped with his camera, audio recorders, and enough field gear to last a month, Adrian was ready to uncover the truth. Yet, as the bus rattled down the uneven road toward the village, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this time, he might have ventured too far. The village emerged from the jungle like a ghost from the mist, its wooden houses weathered and leaning as if burdened by the weight of their secrets. Children darted into the shadows as Adrian arrived, their wide eyes peeking from behind doorways. The air was thick with humidity and a faint, acrid smell that stung his nostrils. An elderly man approached, his back hunched and his eyes clouded with age. This was Adrian's contact, and the village's self-appointed historian. Dr. Locke, greeted him in accented English, his voice a rasp. "You've come seeking the skull wine. But I must warn you, the spirits here are not kind to outsiders." Adrian offered a polite smile, though his pulse quickened at the man's ominous tone. "I appreciate the warning, Mr. High. But I'm here for the truth, whatever that may be." High nodded solemnly, gesturing for Adrian to follow him toward the heart of the village. As they walked, Adrian noticed the villagers' homes were adorned with small altars, each bearing offerings of fruit, incense, and candles. "They're for protection," High explained. "The spirits here are restless. We must honor them to keep them at bay." That night, as Adrian settled into his modest guest house, the village seemed to hold its breath. The jungle was alive with the hum of insects and the occasional cry of nocturnal creatures, yet an unnatural stillness blanketed the air. Just as he began to drift to sleep, a sound pulled him back, soft, mournful wails that seemed to echo from deep within the jungle. He dismissed it as the wind, but a gnawing unease settled in his chest. Somewhere out there, the shrine awaited, and with it, the truth he sought. Adrian's first morning in Funam was shrouded in mist, the pale sun barely piercing the dense jungle canopy. Over breakfast, High shared more about the ritual's dark history. "It began during a great famine," High explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "The villagers believed the spirits of their ancestors could guide them to prosperity. They used the skulls of the dead as vessels, fermenting rice wine within them to honor the departed. But something went wrong." Adrian leaned forward, his notebook open. "What do you mean?" High hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he sipped his tea. "The spirits became trapped. Instead of granting blessings, they grew angry. They punished the living for disturbing their rest." Adrian scribbled furiously, his mind racing. He asked about the shrine, but Hai shook his head. It is deep in the jungle, abandoned for decades. No one goes there anymore. It is a place of death. Despite the warnings, Adrian was determined. That afternoon, he explored the village, noting its decayed beauty. The wooden houses were adorned with carvings of serpents and deities, their intricate details faded by time. The villagers avoided his gaze, their fear palpable. As dusk approached, Adrian returned to the guest house. He reviewed his notes and prepared his gear for the following day's expedition into the jungle. But as night fell, the wailing returned, louder this time. It seemed to come from all directions, seeping through the walls like a living thing. Adrian felt his chest tighten, an invisible weight pressing down on him. He told himself it was the power of suggestion, the villagers' stories playing tricks on his mind. Yet, as he lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The journey to the shrine began at dawn. Hai led Adrian through a narrow path winding between towering trees, their branches interlocking to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air was thick and stifling, every step accompanied by the buzz of insects and the distant cries of unseen creatures. Hai paused occasionally, pointing out subtle signs, claw marks on tree trunks, patches of earth where no vegetation grew. The spirits marked their territory, he said grimly. They warn us to stay away. After nearly 2 hours, they reached a clearing. In its center stood the shrine, a crumbling structure overtaken by vines and moss. The air around it was noticeably colder, the shadows darker. Adrian felt a shiver crawl down his spine. I won't go further, Hai said, his voice trembling. You're on your own now. Adrian nodded, adjusting his camera. He stepped into the shrine, the wooden floorboards creaking under his weight. The interior was dim, the air thick with the scent of decay. Skulls lined the walls, their hollow eyes staring back at him. At the center stood a stone altar, upon which rested a single ceramic jar. Its surface was etched with faded symbols, the wax seal intact. Adrian's heart raced as he approached the altar. He reached out, his fingers brushing the jar's cool surface. For a moment, the air seemed to hold its breath. Then, a low, guttural growl echoed through the shrine. Adrian spun around, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Nothing. He backed away slowly, his instincts screaming at him to leave. As he stepped outside, the jungle seemed to close in around him. The path back to the village felt longer, the trees looming like silent sentinels. That night, as he reviewed his footage, Adrian noticed something chilling. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a shadow, a figure that hadn't been there before. It moved with unnatural fluidity, its outline jagged and distorted. Adrian's hands shook as he paused the video. The legend was no mere story. Something was watching him, and it wasn't human. Tobias's trip to the village seemed destined to challenge his skepticism. The stories about the spirit-infused wine weren't just urban legends whispered in hushed tones, they were treated as a potent truth, one that the villagers avoided mentioning outright. Tobias began his search for answers by meeting the most reliable source he could find, the village shaman. The shaman, an older man named Bango, was known for his deep connection to the spirit world. His small hut was located on the edge of the forest, surrounded by thick vegetation and overgrown vines that seemed to guard the secrets hidden within. As Tobias approached, he noticed something unsettling, a circle of bones carefully arranged around the perimeter of the hut. The air seemed colder here, the forest quieter than it should have been. Tobias hesitated, his gut urging him to turn back, but his resolve pushed him forward. Inside, the shaman's hut was dimly lit by candles. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of preserved herbs, dried roots, and what Tobias swore looked like small animal skulls. A peculiar scent lingered, earthy, herbal, but underlined with the faint tang of decay. Bango sat cross-legged on the floor, his dark eyes piercing through the dim light. You've come far, Bango said, his voice gravelly, as if weighed down by centuries of knowledge. Why have you sought me out? Tobias hesitated for a moment before speaking. I've heard the stories about the spirit-infused wine. I'm here to understand the truth. Bango's expression darkened. That is not a truth you want to uncover, he replied. It is not just a drink. It is a ritual of binding. Those who partake become tied to the spirits it holds, willingly or not. The shaman leaned forward, his gaze intense. You must leave this place, Tobias. Forget what you've heard. Some knowledge is a curse. But Tobias was undeterred. I can't walk away from this, he said, his tone firm. I've come too far. If the stories are true, then this discovery could reveal something extraordinary. Bango shook his head and gestured to a small wooden chest beside him. Reluctantly, he opened it, revealing an ancient manuscript bound in leather. The text was faded, written in an old script Tobias didn't recognize. The shaman pointed to a particular passage. This is what you seek, Bango said. The ritual of the wine. It requires the skull of a tormented soul, one who died in anguish. The wine is not just fermented, it is infused with their pain, their rage, their sorrow. Drinking it is to invite those emotions into yourself. To see through their eyes. To live their final moments. Tobias's heart raced, a mix of fear and fascination. And the stories of people vanishing, he asked. Bango hesitated, then sighed heavily. Those who partake often lose their way. The spirits claim them. Sometimes it is immediate, other times, the effects linger, consuming them slowly. They disappear into the shadows, into the spirit's realm. Despite the warnings, Tobias couldn't shake his determination. I need to see it for myself, he said. Bango's expression turned grim. Then may the spirits show mercy, he whispered. He handed Tobias a small talisman, an intricately carved piece of bone on a string. This will not save you, but it may delay your fate. Wear it and do not remove it. Tobias thanked the shaman and left, clutching the talisman tightly. As he walked back to the village, his thoughts raced. Bango's warnings only deepened the mystery, and Tobias felt himself drawn further into the darkness of this ritual. Little did he know, the shaman's warnings were not exaggerations, they were the last lifeline before a plunge into something far more terrifying. The night after his meeting with Bango, Tobias returned to his lodging in the heart of the village. The small guest house was old and creaky, its wooden beams groaning with every gust of wind. The locals had been unusually quiet, their earlier hospitality replaced by sidelong glances and murmured conversations. It was clear to Tobias that they knew more than they were letting on. As darkness fell, Tobias sat by the window, his notebook open, jotting down his thoughts. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the village. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Just as Tobias began to relax, he heard a faint tapping sound. It came from outside his window. Tobias froze, his pen hovering over the page. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window. The glass was fogged over, but he could make out the outline of a figure standing just outside. "Hello?" Tobias called out, his voice trembling slightly. There was no response. The tapping continued. Gathering his courage, he approached the window. The figure outside didn't move. Tobias hesitated, then wiped the fog from the glass. His heart nearly stopped. The figure was a man, his face pale and gaunt, eyes sunken and hollow. He was wearing tattered clothes, and in his hands, he held a small wooden cup filled with a dark liquid. The man's lips moved, though no sound came through the glass. Tobias stumbled back, heart pounding. When he looked again, the figure was gone. Only the faint outline of a handprint remained on the glass. Shaken, Tobias tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination. But deep down, he knew better. He decided to leave the room and clear his head. As he stepped into the hallway, he noticed the air was colder than it should have been. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching unnaturally. The guest house was eerily silent. Tobias walked toward the kitchen, hoping for some tea to calm his nerves. But as he reached the doorway, he stopped dead in his tracks. The wooden cup from the figure outside was sitting on the kitchen table, filled to the brim with the same dark liquid. A low, guttural whisper filled the room, though Tobias couldn't make out the words. The talisman Bango had given him grew warm against his chest, as if warning him of imminent danger. Tobias backed away slowly, his breathing shallow. Before he could leave, the door to the kitchen slammed shut. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping, each filled with rage and sorrow. Tobias covered his ears, but it did little to muffle the sound. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The room was silent once more. The cup was gone. Tobias was left standing in the dark, his heart racing. He returned to his room, locking the door behind him. That night, he barely slept, haunted by visions of the pale man and the whispers that seemed to echo in his mind. Tobias knew he was being drawn into something far beyond his understanding. The ritual was no longer just a curiosity, it was a living nightmare, and he was at the center of it. The following day, Tobias awoke feeling drained, as if the previous night had stolen more than just his sleep. The whispers still lingered in his ears, faint echoes that refused to fade. His resolve to uncover the truth remained intact, but a growing fear gnawed at him. Whatever was happening in this village, it wasn't just folklore or superstition, it was real. After breakfast, Tobias decided to retrace his steps from the night before. He returned to the guest house kitchen, half expecting to find the wooden cup waiting for him again. But the room was empty, eerily pristine. The only evidence of the previous night was the faint chill that seemed to linger in the air. Tobias shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He decided to visit the village elder, a woman named Mrs. Lin, who had lived in the area for over 70 years. If anyone knew the full history of the ritual, it would be her. Mrs. Lin's house was on the outskirts of the village, a small, weathered structure surrounded by overgrown weeds. Tobias knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it creaked open. Mrs. Lin was a frail woman with deep wrinkles etched into her face, her eyes clouded with age yet sharp with suspicion. She eyed Tobias warily before gesturing for him to enter. "You've stirred the spirits, haven't you?" she said without preamble, her voice thin but steady. Tobias blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Lin sighed, settling into a worn chair by the hearth. "The ritual of the wine is not something to be trifled with. It binds this village to the spirits of the past. Those who interfere," she trailed off, her gaze distant. "They do not leave unscathed." Tobias leaned forward, desperate for answers. "But why? What is the purpose of the ritual? Why does it affect people this way?" Mrs. Lin hesitated, as if weighing whether to reveal the truth. Finally, she spoke. "Long ago, this village was plagued by tragedy. A famine swept through, leaving countless dead. The elders, in their desperation, turned to an ancient rite. They believed that by using the skulls of the departed, they could brew a wine that would appease the spirits and bring prosperity back to the land. And did it work?" Tobias asked. Mrs. Lin's expression darkened. "At a cost. The wine did more than appease the spirits, it anchored them here. Those who drank it could see beyond the veil, but they also became vessels for the spirits' torment. Over time, the ritual corrupted itself. It is no longer a gift, it is a curse." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And now you've drawn their attention. They will not let you go easily." Tobias felt a chill run down his spine. "How do I stop this? How do I break free?" Mrs. Lin shook her head. You cannot stop what has already begun. But you can delay it. Avoid the places where the spirits are strongest. Do not accept their invitations. And whatever you do, do not drink the wine. Tobias left Mrs. Lin's house with a heavy heart. Her words only deepened the sense of dread that had been building since his arrival. As he walked back to the guest house, he noticed the villagers watching him from their doorways, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear. It was as if they knew his fate was already sealed. That night, the tapping returned. Tobias had barely fallen asleep when the sound jolted him awake. This time, it wasn't just a faint tapping, it was a loud, insistent knock, echoing through the room like a hammer on wood. Tobias sat up, his heart pounding. The knock came again, more forceful, as if demanding his attention. Summoning his courage, Tobias grabbed a flashlight and approached the door. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, only another knock. Tobias hesitated, then slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty. But just as he was about to step back inside, he noticed something lying on the floor, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He picked it up cautiously and unwrapped it. Inside was a bone, a human finger bone, smooth and polished. Alongside it was a note, written in the same archaic script as the manuscript Bango had shown him. The note read, "Come to the clearing beyond the forest. The truth awaits." Tobias's first instinct was to throw the bundle away and lock his door. But the pull of curiosity was too strong. He knew this was an invitation, but from whom or what he couldn't say. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his coat and the talisman Bango had given him and headed out into the night. The village was eerily silent as Tobias made his way toward the forest. The moon hung low, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe as he passed. The path through the woods was narrow and overgrown, the trees looming like silent sentinels. Every rustle of leaves made him flinch, his flashlight darting nervously from side to side. After what felt like an eternity, Tobias reached the clearing. At its center was a stone altar, weathered and cracked with age. Surrounding it were the remains of what appeared to be human skulls, their hollow eyes staring blankly into the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. Tobias approached the altar cautiously. As he did, a faint whispering filled the air, growing louder with each step. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping and indistinct, like a chorus of the damned. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You seek the truth, Tobias. But are you prepared to pay the price?" Tobias spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. But there was no one there. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want?" The voice chuckled, low and menacing. "I am the keeper of the wine. The guardian of the spirits bound to this place. You cannot leave until you face what you have awakened." Before Tobias could respond, the ground beneath the altar began to tremble. A dark, viscous liquid seeped up from the cracks, pooling around the base. Tobias stared in horror as the liquid took shape, forming a humanoid figure with eyes that burned like embers. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Tobias stumbled backward, clutching the talisman to his chest. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if studying him. "You carry the mark of the shaman," it said. "A futile attempt at protection. The spirits cannot be denied." Tobias's mind raced. He had no idea how to fight this entity, let alone survive its wrath. But one thing was clear, he had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Tobias stumbled backward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The figure of dark liquid shimmered under the pale moonlight, its fiery eyes fixed on him. The whispers began again, louder and more insistent, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, drowning out his thoughts.
"What do you want from me?"
Tobias shouted, his voice echoing across the clearing. The figure's form rippled, the liquid surging and recoiling as it spoke. You have sought the truth of the wine. You have awakened the bound spirits. The price must be paid. Tobias clutched the talisman tighter, its rough edges biting into his palm. I didn't mean to awaken anything. I was just trying to understand. You cannot unsee what you have seen, the figure interrupted, its voice reverberating like thunder. The spirits demand justice for their torment. Tobias felt a surge of anger through his fear. Justice? You've cursed this village for decades. You've taken lives. What justice could you possibly serve? The figure leaned closer, its molten form distorting grotesquely. The ritual was not our doing. It was theirs. They bound us, forced us into servitude to satisfy their greed. We are prisoners, not executioners. The revelation struck Tobias like a blow. The spirits were victims, not perpetrators. But their wrath had turned them into something monstrous, lashing out indiscriminately. He took a cautious step forward, the talisman still clutched in his hand. If you're prisoners, Tobias said, his voice trembling, then what do you want from me? How do I help you? The figure's fiery eyes flared. To sever the bond, the vessel must be destroyed. But the vessel is not the wine, it is the altar. It anchors us to this place. Destroy it, and the spirits will be free. Tobias glanced at the altar, its surface slick with the dark liquid that seeped from its cracks. It pulsed faintly, as if alive. If I destroy the altar, will the death stop? Will the wine lose its power? The figure nodded, its form wavering. Yes. But know this, those who have partaken of the wine are forever marked. The spirits will be freed, but the mark cannot be erased. You will carry it until the end of your days. Tobias's heart sank. He thought of the villagers, bound by generations of superstition and fear. He thought of the wine's allure, its power to reveal truths no one was meant to see. If he destroyed the altar, he could end it all. But the cost would be his own soul. I'll do it, he said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his limbs. Tell me how. The figure extended an arm, its liquid form stretching unnaturally. In its hand appeared a jagged shard of obsidian, glinting in the moonlight. Strike the heart of the altar. But beware, the spirits will not leave without resistance. Tobias hesitated, then took the shard. The moment his fingers closed around it, a searing pain shot through his palm, as if the shard burned with the fury of the spirits. He staggered but held firm, his resolve unshaken. The figure stepped back, its form dissolving into the ground. Do not falter, Tobias. The spirits are watching. The clearing fell silent, the whispers receding as Tobias turned toward the altar. The obsidian shard felt impossibly heavy in his hand, its jagged edges cutting into his skin. The air around him grew colder, each breath forming clouds that hung in the still night. As he approached the altar, the ground beneath him trembled. The skulls surrounding it seemed to shift, their hollow eyes following his every move. Tobias forced himself to focus, ignoring the mounting dread that clawed at his chest. He raised the shard above his head, aiming for the center of the altar. But before he could strike, a deafening roar filled the clearing. The dark liquid that had formed the figure now surged from the altar's cracks, coalescing into a massive, writhing shape. The spirits had come to defend their prison. Tobias hesitated, his grip faltering. The liquid mass loomed before him, its surface churning with the faces of the dead. They screamed silently, their mouths open in eternal agony. The sight was almost enough to break him, but he steadied himself, remembering the figure's words. You are prisoners, he said aloud, his voice shaking. I'm here to set you free. The mass surged forward, its tendrils reaching for him. Tobias dodged, the shard slipping from his grasp. It clattered to the ground, and he scrambled to retrieve it. A tendril lashed out, striking his shoulder and sending him sprawling. Pain flared, but Tobias forced himself to his feet. He lunged for the shard, gripping it tightly despite the blood dripping from his palm. The spirits screamed, their voices a cacophony of rage and despair. Tobias turned to the altar, his heart pounding. With a primal yell, he drove the shard into the heart of the stone. The impact sent a shockwave through the clearing, the ground shaking violently. The liquid mass writhed and roared, its form disintegrating as the altar cracked and splintered. Tobias fell to his knees, shielding his face as a blinding light erupted from the altar. The spirit's screams reached a fever pitch, then abruptly fell silent. The light faded, leaving only the faint glow of the moon. Tobias looked up to find the clearing empty. The altar was gone, reduced to rubble. The skulls had crumbled to dust. It was over. Tobias staggered back to the village, his body aching from the ordeal. The streets were eerily quiet, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. As he reached the guest house, he noticed the villagers emerging from their homes, their expressions a mixture of confusion and relief. "The whispers are gone," one woman said, her voice trembling. "The spirits, they've left." Tobias nodded, too exhausted to explain. He entered his room and collapsed onto the bed, the obsidian shard still clutched in his hand. Sleep claimed him almost immediately, his dreams mercifully free of whispers and shadows. When he awoke, the village was alive with activity. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over it for so long had lifted, replaced by a sense of cautious hope. Tobias felt a flicker of pride he had done what no one else could. But as he prepared to leave, he noticed something strange. His reflection in the mirror was off. His eyes seemed darker, his skin paler. And when he looked closer, he saw faint, shifting shapes in the depths of his pupils' faces, trapped and screaming. The spirits had left the village, but they had not left him. Tobias closed his eyes, a heavy weight settling over him. He had freed the village, but the price had been his own soul. The mark of the wine would follow him forever, a reminder of the spirits he had released. As he stepped out of the guest house and onto the path leading away from the village, Tobias felt the whispers begin again, not around him, but within him. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there. And they always would be. The road out of the village stretched long and silent before Tobias. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on his shoulders as the whispers, faint but persistent, swirled in the back of his mind. He tried to focus on the path, to convince himself that he had done the right thing, but the faces he had seen in his reflection haunted him. The villagers had thanked him profusely before he left, offering small tokens of gratitude, a loaf of bread, a woven charm, even an ancient coin. Their relief had been palpable, the oppressive air that had suffocated the village for decades was gone. Children played in the streets again, and doors that had been locked tight at night now stood open to let in the sun. Yet Tobias couldn't shake the feeling that he had merely shifted the burden. The spirits no longer haunted the village, but they were still with him, bound to him in ways he couldn't yet understand. Every step he took away from the village felt heavier, as though the spirits were anchoring him, refusing to let him move on. The journey back to the city was uneventful at first. Tobias passed through fields and forests, the sounds of nature offering a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind. But as night fell and the moon rose, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and the whispers louder. He set up camp near a stream, his body exhausted but his mind restless. The fire crackled weakly, casting flickering light on the surrounding trees. Tobias sat with his back against a rock, staring into the flames as the whispers grew more distinct. "You cannot escape us," a voice said, low and guttural. Tobias's head snapped up, his heart racing. The voice wasn't just in his mind, it came from the darkness beyond the firelight. He grabbed the obsidian shard, its cold surface a small comfort. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The shadows shifted, and for a moment, he thought he saw a figure, a silhouette of something not quite human. Its form rippled like liquid, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "You carry the mark," the voice continued. "You freed us, but you are not free." Tobias's grip on the shard tightened. "I did what you asked. I destroyed the altar. I set you free." The figure moved closer, its shape becoming clearer. It was one of the spirits, its face a swirling mass of features that seemed to change with each passing second. "Freedom comes at a cost," it said. "You are our anchor now. Where you go, we follow." Tobias's blood ran cold. He had suspected this, but hearing it confirmed sent a wave of dread through him. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The spirit leaned closer, its fiery eyes locking onto his. "We want what was taken from us. Justice. Revenge. Until our pain is avenged, we cannot rest." Tobias shook his head. "I don't even know who wronged you. The people who did this are long gone." The spirit's form flickered, its voice taking on a sharper edge. "The bloodline continues. The descendants of those who bound us live on. You will find them." Tobias felt a surge of anger. "And what if I don't? What if I refuse to be your tool?" The spirit's eyes flared, and the whispers erupted into a cacophony. "Then you will suffer as we have suffered. The mark will consume you, piece by piece, until nothing remains." The fire sputtered and dimmed, the shadows closing in. Tobias felt a crushing weight on his chest, as though the spirits were trying to drag him into the darkness. He gritted his teeth, clutching the shard with all his strength. "I'll find them," he said through clenched teeth. "I'll find the ones responsible. But you'll leave me alone until I do." The pressure eased, and the whispers subsided. The spirit's form began to dissolve, its fiery eyes the last to fade. "Do not delay, Tobias," it said, its voice echoing in the night. "The mark grows stronger with time." As the spirit disappeared, the fire roared back to life, casting a warm glow over the camp. Tobias slumped against the rock, his body trembling. He had made a deal with the spirits, but he had no idea how to fulfill it or if he even could. Over the following weeks, Tobias dedicated himself to uncovering the truth. He pored over historical records, tracing the lineage of the village's founders and the families who had profited from the cursed wine. The search led him to libraries, archives, and obscure corners of the internet, each clue bringing him closer to the descendants the spirits sought. But the mark was growing stronger. The whispers became more insistent, intruding on his thoughts even during the day. His reflection in the mirror became increasingly distorted, the faces of the spirits pressing against the surface as though trying to break free. Nightmares plagued his sleep, vivid and horrific visions of the spirits suffering. Tobias began to notice other changes as well. Animals avoided him, their instincts sensing the darkness that clung to him. Strangers stared at him on the street, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and fear. He felt the weight of the spirits everywhere he went, a constant reminder of the price he had paid. His search eventually led him to a small town on the outskirts of the city. There, he found a family with ties to the village's founders, a family that had inherited wealth built on the suffering of the spirits. Tobias watched them from a distance, unsure of how to proceed. He couldn't simply confront them and demand they atone for their ancestors' sins. The spirits, however, had other plans. One night, as Tobias stood outside the family's home, the whispers grew deafening. The obsidian shard in his pocket grew warm, almost as if urging him to act. The shadows around him seemed to come alive, coiling and twisting in anticipation. "You know what must be done," the spirits said in unison. Tobias shook his head. "No. I'm not a killer." The shadows surged toward him, wrapping around his limbs and pulling him closer to the house. "You are our justice," the spirits hissed. "They must pay for what was done to us." Tobias fought against the shadows, his mind racing. He couldn't let the spirits turn him into a weapon, but he also couldn't deny the power they held over him. If he refused, the mark would consume him. If he complied, he would lose what remained of his humanity. "I'll make them confess," he said finally, his voice shaking. "I'll make them understand what their family has done. But I won't take a life." The shadows hesitated, then withdrew slightly. The whispers quieted, though they did not disappear entirely. "Do not fail us, Tobias," the spirits said. "Your time is running out." With that, the shadows faded, leaving Tobias alone in the night. He stared at the house, his resolve hardening. He would find a way to break the curse, even if it meant confronting the darkness within himself. But as he turned to leave, he felt the faintest touch of a hand on his shoulder, a cold, intangible presence that sent a shiver down his spine. The spirits were watching, waiting, and they would not be denied. The path Tobias had chosen was fraught with danger, but it was the only one he could take. And as he walked away from the house, the whispers followed, a haunting reminder that the spirit's justice was far from complete.